So in chapter 1, we formulate a problem faced by a rich rentier who wants to consume his wealth in a way that will maximize his total utility of consumption and bequest. In that example, he keeps his money in a savings account earning some interest and a fixed rate of R bigger than 0. And now we will offer this guy a possibility of investing in the stock market, which means we will give him another possibility. That means he can still invest in the bond, but also in the stock. We'll assume that the bond market rate continues to say R, but the stock market rate will be a random rate, but its average rate will be alpha. And alpha will be bigger than R because there is something called a risk premium. So the alpha minus R will be the risk premium that you earn because you take risk. Okay? We will assume only one stock, but that is not a limitation because if you look at the theory of this problem, you will find that if there are n stocks instead of one, then you will have n plus 1 investment vehicles. One is a bond market and one is these n different securities. Turns out that for these models, there's another theorem that goes through. And the theorem is called mutual fund theorem. And the mutual fund theorem in these models will say something like this, that out of the n stock, I can form a mutual fund, which will have certain proportion of each of these stock. And as far as rich investor is concerned, he will be indifferent between having the bond and that mutual fund, or having the bond and the n stock. So if you have a bond and n stock, then his wealth will be allocated to consumption and the bond and each of the stock. Okay. If it's going to be the bond and a mutual fund, then it will be consuming the same amount as the other one. He'll be putting the same amount in the bond as the other one, and he will be putting the same amount in the mutual fund as the total amount in the n stocks. So that theorem goes through. It's called a mutual fund theorem. It was known even before the continuous time dynamic problems. It was known in a static setting, and it continues to go to continuous time when and I'll give you a reference later on because the proof of mutual fund theorem in some places is not completely rigorous, and so I give you some references as I go along. So here we go. We have a savings account, bond market, whatever you call it, but we're going to have it fixed interest. So this is how your wealth will go. If you put S0 amount in at time 0, then at time t, this will have this amount. Okay. So we can write this equation as this equation to be consistent with the new formulation of stochastic control state equations. We can write this as dst equal to rst dt. And we have a stock market. So that stock is with the Brownian motion has a limited liability, which means that stock price cannot go below 0. And so if you assume the P0 to be bigger than 0, it will stay bigger than 0. And you write the equation where this side is left-hand side and right-hand side is a Brownian motion here. This is your Wiener process. This kind of equation has been formulated in finance by long-time people. Merton got his Nobel Prize in '71, and of course Black died long time ago, but Scholz also got the Nobel Prize. So these guys are big guys in finance, and they started modeling the stock market like this. If you model it like this, then you can, this is our equation where sigma pt now becomes the coefficient of the Wiener process. But you notice what happens. If pt is 0, then this side is 0, then dpt is 0, which means if it's 0, it stays at 0. That means it will never go below 0. That means it's a limited liability in the sense that stock market company can lose the value, but the price of the stock market will never go below 0. It will not come after your house. If the stock loses money and you own a stock, and if its value goes down to less than 0, then the government or the company or whoever can come after your house to recoup the loss in the price. Okay. So that is not happening, and that's the beauty of the stock market, that it was limited liability and they cannot come after your private property. Okay, so that's the two equations. Now we have two equations. One is ST, RST, and one is PT. But it turns out that essentially it is just one equation. We will see what happens because the first equation can be solved. So we don't really need to use the two-dimensional setup for the stochastic control problem. It's one-dimensional setup is enough. Because we will see what we can do. We're going to develop the equation for the individual's wealth. And individual's wealth will depend on the price and whatever. So we will do that. And then that becomes the state equation for us. Okay, we already talked about this. So let's develop the model. WT is the wealth at time t. CT is the consumption rate at time t. QT is the fraction of the wealth invested in stock. And 1 minus QT, which is the remaining, is the fraction of the wealth invested in the savings account. CT is the consumption rate, and for any consumption C, I derive instantaneous utility of U of C. Just like other utility function, we assume it to be increasing in concave. We assume rho to be the discount rate, applies to the consumption utility, and we assume B is the bankruptcy parameter. That means if your wealth falls to 0, you become bankrupt. You either lose money or you gain money. But whatever happens, the value of that is called B. Okay? So B is the consequence of going bankrupt. Then DWT can be written, because what is DWT? Well, QT is going in the stock market. That's earning alpha rate of return as a mean rate of return. And it is earning this much deviation on the mean rate of return. So the total amount is random. Part of it is coming there and part of it is coming there. That's how you can break that down. You can break down the random return by its mean and its component in the Wiener process. The 1 minus QT is in the savings account, and they're earn the interest rate of R, so that's no problem. And the CT is the consumption, so CT dt would be the amount of consumption from T to T plus dt. And you put them together and you get a DWT, which is our X now. X is our state variable. The first part is the dt part, which is all the way up to here. This is the dt part, and this is the Brownian motion part. This dt part is called drift. And this Brownian motion called is diffusion term. So this is a drift term, this is a diffusion term. Okay, this is the two terms that comes in the Ito equation. One is a drift. Drift is the mean rate at which this process is evolving. That's called drift. And the other one is what is the deviation from the drift. The together one is a random process. So you see, I don't need the PT anymore because I have brought down everything here. Remember, this alpha dt and sigma dgt is coming from P. It's coming from, because I put that amount in I put QT amount in this, so my return from T to T plus dt would be WT times QT, which is the amount of wealth I put in there, times dpt. Okay, so that gives you that. Okay. Let's continue. Now, Rich is trading continuously. This is continuous time. And we assume that there's no broker's commission. So this is the model. This is the model that was first put forward by Paul Samuelson. And he did it in discrete time. And then his student, Robert Merton, did this in continuous time in 1971. It is 1971 paper that basically opened up this particular field. The 1971 paper by Merton was a long paper in Journal of Economic Theory. It was probably 40, 50-page paper. And it was this paper that one of my mentor, you might call it, a finance professor at University of Toronto, was teaching a PhD level course, and he wanted to cover this, and he has no idea how to cover it because he doesn't know anything stochastic calculus. So he comes to my office and says, "Can you take my class that day and cover this paper?" And so I said, fine. I knew stochastic control by that time. I had come back from Carnegie Mellon so I said, okay, that's good. So I teach this paper in this class. And when I teach this, I discover a few things. First of all, I learn about this, so I make that as my research topic. As you see, I went on to write a book on finance on these topics. And the other thing is that I found some mistakes in Merton. And that started a series of papers with a group of people at Carnegie Mellon and Columbia University math departments. And these 4 people, 3 from there and 1 from me, wrote a number of papers that fix Merton. The mistake was found and written by me in Journal of Economic Theory with another professor, a guy who did his PhD in Russia, in Moscow, under a famous professor named Eugene Dimkin, who was a well-known man in Markov processes and a professor at Cornell University at the time. Okay, so all of that is a little history that brought me into this topic, and I will cite those papers as I come along. T is the time at which the wealth goes to 0. We call this as a stopping time. The stopping time is a random variable that you don't know before until you get there. The stopping time happens when you get there. So then you know you're there. So what happens here is your wealth is going like this, and it's always positive, let's say, for a while, and then it goes to 0, and you know it goes to 0. So you know exactly when you become bankrupt. Now, if your wealth is a little bit more than bankruptcy, like epsilon, you can only say I might go bankrupt soon, but you cannot say I will go. You cannot say when it's going to happen, because this may go up. You may be very lucky and you become a millionaire in the next 1 month, or you may become broke in the next 5 seconds. You don't know that, right? But you know it when it happens. Okay, that's called a stopping time. That's the easy way of defining stopping time, although there's a mathematical description in terms of sigma algebra. We don't want to go there right now. Okay, so we have a problem of maximizing the utility of consumption, discount at the rate rho, and going bankrupt at some stopping time t. This could be infinity. You may never go bankrupt. And collecting a value b or losing a value b, but in this case it's collecting because it's plus b, but b could be negative. And we take the expected value. Okay. And you can see my book, 1997 book, for the huge discussion of all these things, because it's a book devoted only to this problem. Part of the reason I send you that book is because I am the first one who bring in the bankruptcy to this problem. Before that, Merton and his students and many doctoral theses that came after Merton paper did not do bankruptcy. And so I said, okay, people go bankrupt, so let's put bankruptcy in it. So that's that term. Merton has this as infinity, and he makes conditions so that people don't go bankrupt, and there he makes mistakes, and he doesn't have this stuff. So these are all little things that I can talk to you right now about without going into too much detail. So this is our stochastic control problem. We have an objective function, we have a state equation, and we have a constraint on consumption. It is that constraint that gets Merton in problem. Merton's paper actually has models, not all of them, where consumption becomes negative. He doesn't realize that. And none of the students and other people who write these papers for the next 15 years realize that. It was a 1971 paper. It took us somewhere in 1980 that we wrote this paper called, we corrected Merton in a paper on Journal of Economic Theory. It's a paper by Sethi and Taxer. It's cited in my book somewhere. Okay. Once we have the problem, we know how to write a current value Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman equation for infinite horizon. And when you do that, you have this. This is a straightforward application of the value function equation. Remember, I wrote on V on this side, and then the drift term on this side, and the diffusion term, and the integrand of the objective function. Two control variables, maximum C bigger than or equal to 0. Consumption has to be bigger than or equal to 0, and Merton doesn't do that, and that's why he gets into trouble. Merton is lucky on this one because Q is unbounded. It can be negative or positive. It means that you can borrow money. If negative in the stock means you're going short. Negative in the bond means you're going short on bond. You're borrowing money from the bank and putting money in the stock market. So you can go stock, you can go short on stock and put money in the bank, or you can borrow from the bank and put in the stock. So Q can be any number. So if Q is 5, 1 minus Q is minus 4. So Q and 1 minus Q are the two investment proportions that go to these two different securities. So Q is unconstrained, so you can take the derivative and set it equal to 0. C is unconstrained, then you could do that, but it's not. You cannot have C negative. So you cannot simply take derivative unless you can guarantee that C is never going to go to 0. And that is not happening in Merton. He takes the derivative, set it to 0, he solves the problem, he solves the problem, you get a wrong solution, okay? In some cases. But I'm not saying the paper is bad. I'm just saying part of the paper had to be corrected. If you read my paper on how I corrected, I give a lot of introduction to say very good things about the paper before I kill the guy. So let's do. So while Sethi and Taxer found the mistakes and wrote a paper, it was Karachus, Lasky, Sethi, Shreve, 4 people, that actually wrote the definitive paper on portfolio consumption problem that fixed the Merton, but also solved the problem of C bigger than or equal to 0, and also took the constraint and solved the problem where the constraint is active. All of that was done in 1986 paper. 1986 paper was a 106-page paper that was sent to Journal of Economic Theory, and they read 6 pages and rejected it. We wrote a letter to them saying, that's not what they say. Well, they They had this procedure, and eventually we didn't succeed there. So we sent it to MOR, Math of Operations Research, and they reviewed the 106-page paper. They said paper is accepted if you can write the paper into 50 pages. That's it. So and it will be accepted without further review. So we wrote the paper into 50 pages, sent it to MOR, and they accepted the paper. The 106-page paper appears in my book. 97 book, I decided I'm going to put all of that in my book. A lot of things obviously were left out, but they were all mathematics. The 1986 paper is essentially complete, other than gory details of mathematics that is sitting in my book. Okay, so let's see. One of the conditions that Merton ignores is this condition. He has utility functions where u prime 0 is not infinity. If u prime 0 is infinity, Karatsas et al. Has shown that C can never become 0. That C will always be above 0. And if it's always going to be above 0, then Merton is saved. But wherever it is not, then Merton is not saved. These solutions are totally wrong. Was not recognized for a long time. Okay, so in our book, this book, we're going to assume u prime 0 equal to infinity. Log C is certainly satisfies that. You take the derivative is 1 divided by C, it goes to infinity, C equal to 0. Okay, but a lot of other don't. And whenever they don't, then they get problems. And if C is less than 0, and if B is less than U0 divided by rho, what is U0 divided by rho? It says that if I consume zero utility, zero consumption forever, and if zero consumption utility is U of 0, then my present value of the objective function will be U0 divided by rho. That's the discounted value of the stream of utilities of U0. And if I get B less than U0, then I don't want to go bankrupt. That means I personally would not want to go to bankrupt. And so we're going to assume both of these. And certainly, if U0, if U prime 0 is infinity, then U0 is minus infinity. Oh, just a second. Let me. And we need a B equal to 0 then. Or we need B equal to minus infinity. So in this book, we're going to assume U prime 0 equal to infinity. And when U prime 0 is infinity, in many cases, U0 is minus infinity. And then we're going to assume B to be minus infinity. And that setup, we have no zero consumption. Consumption will strictly bigger than 0. And we have no bankruptcy. So there is no stopping time. And it's an infinite horizon problem. And that is the problem we are going to devote in this book. Any other require a lot of extra work. And I refer you to my book, 1997 book, and papers that are covered in that book. Either way. So we're going to begin with log of C, and there are a few other utility functions that we used in this book, either in here or in exercises, but they all go the same way in some way. And the procedure that we use is we're going to guess the solution, and then we estimate the parameters, or we find the parameters by solving some equations. And many of the exercises that are here in the book go along the same line, because I'm not asking you to solve the differential equations. I'm asking you to do the procedure that we are doing, just guessing it and then finding the parameters. And the guess will be provided to you. Although you will know what the guess will be after a while, but it will be given to you. And every exercise we give the guess. Okay. So once you do that, I can take a derivative of this with respect to C and a Q. because C is also now, C is always going to be bigger than 0, so I'm never going to run into a constraint. So the first order conditions are good. So I take the first order condition. The first order condition with respect to C and with respect to Q gives me this, and with respect to C gives me this. So that means this is my control. This is my investment in the risky securities, and 1 minus Q will be the risky in the non-risky securities. And once I find the value function, I'm done. This is simple, right? It's a recipe with some conditions that make the problem very difficult. But remember, 1971 paper by a Nobel laureate guy only solved this problem the one that I'm solving right now. That is exactly what that's exactly what it did, more or less. But he guessed the solution for the other problem wrong. So he made a guess of a solution, and that solution is correct as long as u prime 0 is infinity, and that solution is wrong when it is not. And that is shown in our paper in Sethi and Taksir. And then we substitute these values. We substitute these values in this equation, this equation, and we get a equation without max, and that's our equation that we need to solve. This equation. This equation looks very difficult to mathematicians. When we had this equation, because now Merton did the guess and his solution was not correct in cases when u prime 0 is not infinity. And we want to solve this problem when u prime 0 is not infinity. And that guess is wrong, and we need to figure out what to do. So we need to solve this problem. And we went to top guys in differential equations and say, here's the equation, can you solve it? They said there's no hope in hell that you can solve this equation. It's so nonlinear. There's a Vx squared term, there's a denominator of V sub xx, another denominator of V sub x, there's log of Vx. It is a mess. But we were lucky and we solved the problem. When we solved this problem, it required two big things, and because mathematicians were very saying that they are kind of difficult to solve and not no hope in hell, we call both of these things as two miracles. First miracle and the second miracle that appears in my book if you want to talk about it. But these were the two things that we needed to solve this, but because we couldn't guess it, we had to solve it, so we did. Now we can guess because we have a u prime 0 equal to infinity, so we are not going to go there. So you can buy the MOR paper, or you can read the 106 page in my book. Either way, there are many things there that are interesting, but this is what I'm going to do now. That is the form that I'm going to use, and so then I only need to find out A and M. By the way, the reason I changed this to M now, the book still has B, but the B, remember, was the value of the bankruptcy. So it was pretty bad to have a same B in a model that has a B already specified. So I changed it to M, and that's just another constant. And then what you do is you can find out V sub x, you can find out V sub double x. And when you do that, you substitute those things in that equation and you get something like this. And then by comparing the coefficient in log x and a constant on both sides, because it's good for every x, we can find that those constants would have to be 0. And then when those constants 0, we get a equal to 1 by rho and m equal to this. So we get a value function. This is the value function of the problem. And once you have the value function, you can find out the control. So you can see that the consumption will be always rho times your wealth. So if my wealth is $100 and rho is 0.01, then I will use $1 rate of consumption. And this is the fraction I would invest in stock. As you can see that this fraction goes up in alpha, rather goes up in alpha minus r. That means if my risk premium is high, then I'm earning a lot of money, right? And so more the risk premium, more money I should invest. On the other hand, if my sigma is high, then the risk is very high. So more the risk, less I should invest. So it is the balance between the risk premium and the risk. So if the risk premium is higher than risk in this kind of metric, then I put more money there. If it's lower, then I put less money there. That's the idea here. These are not our results. I mean, Merton has these results. As long as u prime 0 is infinity in his paper, he has the same formulas. So Q star, W star T is given by this, and consumption you can see is this is a fraction. So the total amount is that time WT, W star T. So amount allocated and consumption are all stochastic processes because WT is a stochastic process. These are some of the references. I want to talk a few things about that before. Fleming and Stoner, both are my co-authors in different papers. They bring in short selling constraint. They say, what if I cannot short sell? And so there's another constraint that we don't do, they do. And that is another extension to Merton problems. And there is a question of why is that Davis or Davis Norman? Huh? Oh no, it's Davis. Okay, I don't have that. Oh, they're coming later. So this is with jump processes. Sorry, so I'm going on. If you have impulse control where you can put money right away, you can consume instantaneously certain big amount, or you can invest quickly in an instant a certain amount of money. Then you need impulse control, and we already talked about impulse control several times in this lecture in this class. Jump diffusion means you can have a Markov process that is jumping, and there could be a Poisson process together with it. So that would be this. There's the application of manufacturing problems. Sethi and Zhang has a whole book on that. Yin and Zhang were both of my postdocs. They have another book. Finance, there's my book here, and there's a huge book by Karatsis Shreve, which is a definitive book on Brownian motions and diffusion processes and stochastic control. Stochastic control, especially it's stochastic control, and it applies to. It has an application in finance. The marketing application, there are I don't know why I didn't put my own Sethi because it's already covered in this. So these are the other references. And then there are economics references doing stuff on this. I think I want to say a few more things here. I want to say that there is we assume that there was no transaction cost. So there are two extensions of this problem. One is the transaction cost is kind of not a fixed cost, but a proportional cost. And there are huge papers, people go like 50, 60 page long papers by Soner and Shreve and other people that talk about those kind of problems. And then they have it requires a heavy bit of mathematics, and you need to learn something called local times, which means that you infinitely fast invest very small amount. So what it means is that if you are supposed to stay on the line over time, the only way to stay in line is through the local time. It is mathematically possible, but if you were going to do that in a bank, you have to run to the bank infinitely fast, and each time you give small amount of money to the bank and take this limit. So it's not something which is that easy to deal with. Then when we were writing the 50-page version from 106 page, I ran into Mark Davis, who was a professor at Imperial College, and I have papers with him later. But I told him, maybe I had a paper even before that. But anyway, I wrote to him. I told him that the problem with transaction cost, when transaction cost is fixed cost, like SS policy in inventory problems, that problem is not solved. So Davis and Norman wrote the first correct paper taking account the transaction cost. That also came in MOR. That was extended our paper to fixed cost paper, but the mutual fund theorem doesn't go through. So they have only one stock and one bond. The mutual fund theorem rigorously proved in Karachas and Lasky, Sethi Shreve 1986 paper. So you can also see my book or go to 86. Any other places in continuous time, there is no clear proof of mutual fund theorem as we provide. So that kind of sums up the boundary of this setting. Now that when you come to economics, I was kind of thinking that when I saw Arrow, Arrow is everywhere. He was one of the giants in economics, and he has made lots and lots of contributions, including voting paradox and utility theory and general equilibrium, and his students like Meyerson and others have gone to revelation principle in mechanism design. So this guy is seriously an impossibility theorems in economics. So I just wanted to say that when I was doing growth economic problems, you saw that we assume in chapter 11, we assume that population is growing exponentially. But Arrow wrote a paper, a 6-page paper, many years later in his life, after he spent all his life with exponential growth of population. He wrote that exponential growth of population assumption is obviously ridiculous. That's what he wrote. He basically said everything I did, exponential assumption in population, was absolutely ridiculous. The problem is that without that, the problem is difficult to solve. It becomes more than one-dimensional problem, and all that phase diagram thing is single-dimensional kind of thing, so it was very difficult. So I got this 6-page paper from Arrow, and I wrote to him, and it actually came differently. I met this guy in a game theory conference even before he had Nobel Prize, and he knew me somehow. I don't want to get into that. Some connection through his advice. My advisor was one of his students at Stanford many years ago, so he got to know me somehow. So he introduced me, and I said, "Well, you don't have to introduce me. I know you very well." And then that was that. And then many years later, I was nominated for the American AAAS, and I needed a big reference. So I called Arrow that I need a big reference. He said, "You write one." And during that time, I said, "Do you still remember me?" He said, yeah. And so he writes a reference for me. And then I asked him, "What are you doing?" So he sent me this 6-page paper. That was what he was doing at the time. And when I looked at this, I said, "This is a good way to start with. Let me solve this problem." He basically says exponential growth is no good, but here is first order condition. But he doesn't solve the problem. So Ben Susan and I and start looking at that problem, and we actually solve that problem. And then we need somebody to do numerical analysis. So my student Annabelle Feng, who was one of my first students at UTD, who's now a chair professor at Purdue, we got her to join, and she did all the numerical part of that. And she's a good mathematician herself. So we wrote that paper with non-exponential growth. And that paper came out in the National Academy of Science Proceedings, and that's with Kenneth Arrow. So we have Arrow Ben-Susan, Fang, Seti, I don't know, alphabetical order of some sort. And then we wrote other paper where the growth of the population is endogenous, which means you can control the population by consumption and other means. And we sent this paper to some place, and they said, so we put some wealth should go into consumption and medical care and no, health and investment. And we can say the higher the health, higher the mortality, and this and that. And that paper was killed by one reviewer in one line. He said that every country that is rich, United States, Japan, their population is going down. And our model says that if you put health, mortality goes down and health population goes up. It just doesn't work. And I talked to Aero said the guy's right. So what do we do with this paper? We have a great mathematics and no motivation. And so I said, okay, I have to do this mathematics. I have to publish it. I have to find a motivation. So I read a lot of stuff on population, and I finally found out that Japan is a good case for me. Japan has what is called a baby bonus. Their population rate is going down. Their population is shrinking. Japanese do not want a non-homogeneous society. They don't want to immigrate people from different countries like US does. And so they need to encourage people to make more babies. So they give baby bonuses to have. It may not be successful, but that's what they do. And I said, that's my model. I have a model in which natural population is going down, and I'm going to put money in baby bonus to increase that rate, and I'm going to put money in consumption to derive the utility, and of course investment. And now I have a motivation, and that mathematics remains the same, and we published that paper. So these are the two papers that we wrote with Aero, where the population is endogenous or population is not exponential. And those are the serious extensions of the growth models, because all the growth models in literature do not do that. Anyway, but there's no stochastic. So now the world has become stochastic, and I'm working with some people in Hong Kong, and I went to Susan along to see if we can make those models stochastic. We have not finished that paper yet. So with those notes and with those remarks, we have actually finished stochastic control, and now we will use this theory to solve differential games. And differential games are games in continuous time. So we will go through Nash games, go to Steckelberg games. We'll have some applications, and that basically will finish the course. And my current work is into this area of Steckelberg games. I'm working on Steckelberg games with production and inventory problems or supply chain problems, let's put it this way. My current focus is on making supply chain dynamic, so at least 2-period, and they require 2-period Steckelberg games. My other focus is on differential games in Steckelberg games in advertising, and we have recently thinking of doing something where we think of Steckelberg differential game with asymmetric information. So you see all the asymmetric information paper in economics are single period, and the mechanism design breaks through. The revelation principle doesn't go through when you have a multiple periods, and what to do. So that's something that we are thinking to work on. If any of you guys are interested in working on some of these problems, do contact me or Ben Susan. Okay, we'll be happy to do something. And also, in our school, you don't have to write one topic. You can collect 2 or 3 papers in your thesis and put them together and make it a doctoral thesis. So feel free to work with more than one people if you want to. Okay, that one is finished. Oh, we are 3:45, right? Or 3:30? I think it's 3:45, right?
3:45.
Okay, why don't you bring in chapter 13? So we can do a little bit of a beginning kind of part, which everybody knows. Because it's a big chapter. It's a combination of 2 chapters, so it's a good idea that we can do a little bit now. Oh, Hyung is finally here.
See chapter 13, Professor?
Yes, I see. So let's just do a little bit of thing and maybe even some deterministic game, some definitions, and you have learned game theory somewhere else as well a little bit, so it will be more of a review, I think. So, but remember we are doing dynamic games. So what you have done so far, if you have done, is going to be also most of the game theory that you do in game theory class is going to be static games. People don't do dynamic games here. Gary Bolton and I have even disagreement. He called dynamic games, which I don't call dynamic. So he asked me one time, I said that what you do is not dynamic games, but what you do is what is called repeated games, which is not same as dynamic games. Okay. So far we had a single objective function. But when it comes to game, it's more than one person. And each one of them may have an objective function or maybe some another way. But there are question now is that different people are coming into there and they have their own objective function and they may have set of differential equations, and the question is how to deal with that. This is basically called the theory of differential games. And history of this was actually goes all the way back to Rufus Isaacs in 1965, who was working at Rand Corporation at the time, and he wrote certain notes. Many of his papers are not published, but mostly his notes are the famous ones, and that is the origination of the differential games. When Pontryagin developed his principle, which was after 65. No, Pontryagin developed principle was 1958, 59, so it was about the same time. There's a connection. One finds a connection between what Rufus Isaacs did and what Pontryagin did, and so there's a connection with differential game and optimal control theory. But differential games are kind of generalization of the cases when there's more than one controller or player. But the situation becomes more complex because you don't know what is the solution anymore. So in a single agent problem, the solution is maximize or minimize. That's it, finished. Games, it's not clear. And so there are many different solution concepts. They're all called, in some sense, equilibrium. And one is called Minimax. One is called Nash. One is called Steckelberg. There are possibilities of cooperation and bargaining. And so we will in this chapter, we will first begin with Minimax. Maybe we can cover that material. And after Minimax, we'll tell you Nash, and after Nash, we go to Steckelberg. So you go stages. What is Minimax? Minimax, so let's just take 2 people. One person control is U, and another person's control is V. So one guy is U, one guy is V, and X is the state that are both people affected by, and the state is deterministic in this 13.1 section. So far we are not going stochastic, and we're going to assume everything X is a scalar. Vector cases require appropriate interpretation, so again, which is straightforward, but we don't want to do that. ut belongs to some u and v, v, so those are kind of convex sets. Standard formulation here. Here is the first part that makes these games. We have an objective function, which is given by this. So we have a salvage value function and we have a 0t. This is same as our chapter 2, 3, or 4, except that now I have a v. Instead of just u, we have a u and a v. And what happens in a zero-sum game is that one person, player one, wants to maximize, and player two wants to minimize. So because one wants to maximize, one wants to minimize, the sum of those two objective functions will be 0. And that's why these games are called zero-sum differential game, because the sum of the two objective functions is 0. Okay. So basically, this is their serious opponent. Whatever you do, I will do the opposite. This really sums up the Democratic Party and the Republican Party right now. Whatever the Democratic Party says, what I do, the Republican Party basically says no. So it's a zero-sum game going on in Washington, D.C. right now, in some sense. Okay. So what is the definition of equilibrium? Well, equilibrium will be a point where one guy is maximizing, one is minimizing. That's our saddle point. You remove the saddle point. In this direction, it was minimum, and that direction was maximum. Okay. This horse, if you horse, I'm facing a horse, this is maximum. And if you go that way on the horse's back, that point is minimum of the horse. Okay. So the definition of equilibrium is there's a U star by player one who's maximizing, and there's a V star by player two, which is minimizing. Then JU star V, so this is the equilibrium. This equilibrium says that if V deviates, then V loses, because V for any other than V star is bigger. But remember, V is trying to minimize. So anything bigger is not good for him. So any V is not as good for him as V star. On the other hand, look, if U star changes to U, then this quantity is less than that quantity, which means that he's maximizing, so he's also losing. Losing in the sense of objective function, right? Not in sense of inequalities, but in sense of objective function. So equilibrium is a point where which if you deviate, you lose. If other guy deviate, he loses. Okay, so that's kind of a minimax solution. It's called minimax solution. And these were the first games that were solved, even in a static setting. The static setting, zero-sum games were first dealt with in a comprehensive manner by von Neumann and Morgenstern. And there was a famous book, Theory of Economic Games and Economic Behavior. That book was quite much before Nash. And that book basically was devoted to zero-sum games. It was a huge book and a lot of theory. And it established the game theory as a field. Then Nash comes along and he says, okay, that's not good. One guy maximizes, one not good, minimize. Why not one guy has one objective function, other guy has another objective function? And this guy maximizes his objective function, this guy maximizes his objective function. So now we have two objective functions with two players. And now there's an equilibrium. Equilibrium will be similar to this way, but it is a different model, and that's called Nash equilibrium. So that'll come to 13.2. And then Stackelberg comes before Nash, and he decides that there's a hierarchy. There's a leader and a follower. The leader decides, then follower reacts. The leader knows what the reaction would be, so leader solves the game knowing the reaction of the follower, and that game is called a Stackelberg game. But Stackelberg game, I'm talking about the single period now, okay? All of this, I'm talking about single period. Nash is single period, Stackelberg is single period, von Neumann and Morgenstern is single period. All of that single period. But other people, lesser people than these guys, they do extensions. After fundamentals have been created, you do extensions. And extensions were done by a number of people, and that extensions are game theory in continuous time. And what we are going to do is basically do those. So we do Hamiltonian. And same thing, we do the Hamiltonian. And there's a lambda dot is minus hx. That's the adjoint equation. Everybody has the same salvage value. One is positive, one is negative, of course, but lambda t is xxt. So we need only one lambda. But the Hamiltonian has to be maximized by one guy and minimized by other guy. So that's the difference. We are so far same, right? We have only one objective function, although there are two in principle, but mathematically it can be done by one. And mathematically I can done by lambda, because minus lambda would be in some sense by the other guy. He has to define his Hamiltonian will be minus h minus lambda. It'll be exactly minus of this guy. So when you maximize one and the other guy minimizes that, then other guy is maximizing the minus of that. So you can see that is the connection. So you don't need two sets. You just interpret the way in terms of max and min. So now you can see the Hamiltonian should be minimum over V and maximum over U. So U star V star is a minimax solution if this quantity is this quantity, or the same way. That is exactly the same as this. This is the game theory in the static or dynamic, whatever you want to call it. But that game says that Hamiltonian at each instant the two players are playing a Hamiltonian zero-sum game at the level of Hamiltonian. So they are playing a level of Hamiltonian zero-sum games at each instant. And lambda is decoupling that, just like in our regular control theory problems. When we have lambda, we don't have to worry about the future when we solve the Hamiltonian problem. It's instantaneous maximization at each time t. That is a saddle point. We already talked about that in chapter 1. And so this is the theory. And if U and V are unconstrained, there is full dimensions of space E1, then we can do the first order condition. H equal to 0, H equal to 0. But the second order conditions are different. One is maximizing, one is minimizing. So HU is less than 0 and HVV is bigger than 0. Okay, that's also true in the previous chapter, but the problems are such that most of the time the first order condition gives you the maximum, so we don't usually talk so much about it. But if you write a paper and you have doubt about it, then you may have to talk about that. I think we are done. And we have finished non-zero zero-sum game. We don't solve too many things, but zero-sum games came about, brought the theory of games, but they are not so interesting. Okay. There are, however, a lot of mathematics that have been generated on zero-sum games. And one of the interesting problems in zero-sum game is a problem called Homicidal Chauffeur problem. That means there's a guy, chauffeur, who's driving a car and is homicidal. He wants to kill the other guy. So the games are that the driver of the car wants to kill a pedestrian. And so you can think about the distance between these two. And one guy wants to minimize the distance between the two, and one guy wants to maximize the distance between two. You see the zero-sum game coming into play there. And this game has become, Rufus Isaac started with that as well. And this game has become kind of, because you can create problems that are rather difficult to solve and can require a lot of mathematics. And so it's become quite of interest to people. So now I can make the problem more difficult. So what do? I can say, okay, the car and the pedestrian are in an arena, which is a circle. So now they cannot go out of the circle. How to solve that problem now? now we can say, okay, so there's another thing. In a circle, the car has a high speed, the pedestrian has low speed. So what is the advantage of the pedestrian? If there's no advantage, the pedestrian will get killed, right? So the advantage of the pedestrian is that the pedestrian can move, change direction very fast. But the car cannot change direction very fast. So there's a limitation on how fast the car can change the direction. So that, again, makes it mathematical. A lot of parameters involved. Again, you want to find a closed form solution. So then there are games where you can say, okay, the time to capture the guy is the objective function. Okay, so in that game, we know the guy get killed. But the objective function is that the guy wants to get killed at the latest time, and the car wants to kill the guy at the earliest time. Again, zero-sum game, right? So these are the kind of games that people solve. They are not games in management science or economics or whatever. And so not much application in real life, but a lot of mathematics got created, which is nice. And so then Nash comes along, and Nash wins the Nobel Prize for his theory of Nash Equilibrium. Again, he did in static setting, and we will take that up next week.